Greetings and welcome everyone. With the new meta patch being applied to Robocraft today, I figured that while we wait, either for the patch to be applied or for the service to be resurrected, because let's face it, there's a fairly good chance of that happening, or rather needing to happen, that I'd take some time to cover the patch notes for this update. Something for us to while away those agonizing minutes whilst we wait to log in. Now, as with the last update video, I'll have some battle footage playing in the background while I talk, though there may be a few screenshots sprinkled throughout, so apologies if I obscure any action that you're trying to follow. But before I begin, let me just point out that while this patch is huge, honestly, more of an expansion than a patch in my opinion, I won't be covering, or even trying to cover, every little change. But I will try to cover the main changes in some detail. So for the value-focused, I will include a link in the video description to the official patch notes, which compile all manner of smaller changes into one giant list. But to get on with the update then. Now, obviously the first and most important part of this update is the new game mode is going to be introduced, which includes Protonium crystals, which we need to destroy to win the game, Overclocking on our robot, which allows for a certain type of per battle leveling up. These level ups don't carry over to the other battles, it's just in that one battle. We've got fusion towers, which we need to capture in order to make winning the game significantly easier, or to provide bonuses to our team. The fusion shield, which is the main thing deterring us from simply walking into someone's base and smashing all of their Protonium crystals and winning the game. There's a respawning mechanic, which is brand new now. Well, I mean, most of this is brand new, but the respawning mechanic is probably the biggest new thing, because that is going to have, by far, the most significant change on the way that we play the game. There are massive combat mechanic changes, and, of course, with anything like this, big balance changes. However, contrary to what was believed at the time, when I did my last big update sort of cover of this change, we are keeping the old game modes. They are going to be renamed to Classic Mode and will include both Challenge and Mega Boss. Now, even when the idea was to include Classic Mode, there wasn't any certainty that Challenge modes and Mega Boss modes would be staying as well, but they are staying, which is, I'm sure, music to many people's ears. Now, the launch is today, which is the 29th of April, and this will be the pre-launch. It'll contain all of the features, but in their initial balance states. So expect changes, because right now, effectively, we're going to be massively beta testing these changes. And in a week from now, on the 6th of May, the full launch will be applied. And at that point, most of the values will be nailed down, or at least more nailed down than they are now. I mean, with a game like Robocraft, everything is subject to change all of the time, but they'll have a much better idea of where these values need to be. Now, I spoke about Protonium crystals, so let's start the actual updatey part of this update by talking about the Protonium crystals and, of course, the reactor. Now, each team's base in the new game mode will have a Protonium reactor, that is Protonium. The reactor is a cluster of crystals surrounding a central reactor conduit called the core, and to win the game, simply put, you have to destroy all of the crystals connecting to the reactor. The actual mechanic for destroying the core is somewhat similar to the way that you break a robot. That is by disconnecting all of the functional components from the pilot seat. There are a total of 632 crystals clustered around the core, but not all of those crystals are directly connected to the core itself. So all you really need to do is break the crystals that directly connect to the core. And as a result, all of the crystals connected to those crystals will effectively be severed. The crystal health ranges, because each crystal obviously based on tier will have a different health, ranges from 544 at tier 1 all the way up to 23,479 per crystal at tier 10. But wait, there's more. Fusion towers are also being added to each map. First and foremost, due to the shape of the tower, the 127 crystals that will be housed underneath a sort of distinctive umbrella-like structure will be afforded quite significant protection from being just sniped from across the map. Additionally, extended sections of the umbrella, which will be positioned quite intentionally, will offer protection from certain strategically advantageous points around the structure. Now, in a nutshell, I take it that this is there to focus anyone who wants to capture a tower to attack the tower up close and personal, which will increase the opportunity for direct conflict around the base of and in the sky above the towers themselves, because there's a hole cut out of the very top of the umbrella, like shield, if you like, which will allow any air, any flyers or copters to bombard the crystals from above. But you're not going to be able to do it from an angle. You're going to have to be pretty close right above the tower to be able to make those shots. Each map will have 4 towers, though their positions are different per map. They're roughly going to be in the top left, right, lower left and lower right of the map. And at the start of the game, all towers will be neutral, meaning they must be captured at least once before they start to contribute anything at all to the battle. There'll be new HUD elements, which will show the health of the team's reactor and the health and allegiance of the 4 towers. The towers themselves play, well, a not insignificant role in the game. First and foremost, should a team take all of the towers, that is, they capture and control all 4 towers at once, then the enemy team's fusion shield, which protects their base and reactor from long-range attacks, will deactivate, leaving them extremely vulnerable. This would be the point where all of your snipers should be pretty much just refocusing all of their efforts on attacking the base itself, rather than the people scurrying around, or at least if they're in a position to do so. You only need to capture 1 tower, though, to restore your shields back to full activation. There isn't a health that I'm aware of on the shield. You can't just hit it enough to make it go down. It is pretty much completely impervious. If it's on, it's protecting against any kind of shot from the outside. Well, with some caveats, I'll discuss those in a moment. And if it's off, there's no protection at all. Though bear in mind, if the battle reaches 30 minutes, then both teams' shields will deactivate, regardless of who owns the towers. Each tower will grant an additional 250 clock cycle boost to every member on a team per second. Now, this is the important part, whether that team member is alive or waiting to respawn. Now, that is a huge thing to consider, because everyone on the team who's out of it, who's currently waiting on a respawn, can still be getting leveled up by the towers that their team controls. Capturing a fusion tower will instantly respawn every teammate who is currently waiting for a respawn as well. Now, that is a pretty big thing, and I imagine that's going to be much more important later on in the game, where the respawn times can be much longer. Now, I've mentioned the fusion shield. The shield is an enormous impervious dome that surrounds the Protonium reactor itself, which may as well be thought of as your base at this point. The shield activates automatically 10 seconds into the game, and will deactivate automatically at 30 minutes. Enemies cannot shoot into the shield from the outside, but allies can shoot into the shield from the outside, meaning that it's easier to protect your own base from outside than it is for the enemy to damage you from the outside. In fact, it's impossible for them to do so. They have to cross the threshold of the shield. The shield doesn't block them moving through it, that's important to note. It just prevents shots from moving through it. However, enemies can shoot from the inside to the outside, so they're not sitting ducks. You know, if the enemies are inside your shield, you can't just sit on the outside, you know, effectively, completely immune from their retaliation just while you're hammering them. So they will be able to retaliate once they get inside your shield. Now, the other big thing about the shield is any allies within the area of effect of the shield, as long as it's turned on, will be automatically healed. Now, the fusion shield heal rates differ by tier, but generally they've been balanced with the idea to allow a single lone ally to defend against 2 enemy units on their own. But for some actual values, the heal rates range from about 134 per second, I assume, at tier 1 to 11,054 at tier 10. And on the subject of respawning, there exists around each base an area designated the safe zone and the defense zone. The safe zone generally will lie within the area of the fusion shield, and assuming that no enemies are currently within this area, then any respawning allies will spawn here. However, if there are enemies in the safe zone, that is more or less inside the area of the fusion shield, then respawning allies will instead spawn in the defense zone, which lies just outside the shield. It's a fairly large area though. And the spawn location within these zones is randomized. And this is, from what I understand, to reduce instances of spawn camping, because it's going to be hard to predict where someone is going to spawn, and because the area is large enough, you're not going to be able to really cover that without spreading your attacking force too thin. There's a respawn timer, and in a nutshell, the time it takes to respawn is affected both by how long the game has already been running for, with respawning at the start of battle taking much less time, but as the battle plays on it begins to take progressively longer, and also your overclock level, which I will cover in a moment. The higher your level, the longer it will take to spawn. These mechanics are cumulative, so a high level player dying at around the 30-minute mark will have as much as 90 seconds to wait before they respawn. Now, I'm not sure how long the respawn timer is at the very beginning of the game, so we'll have to see how that kind of scales up. I think the minimum, though, from what I remember reading in the patch notes, is 15 seconds. Players can, however, elect to respawn without being destroyed by the enemy, but they can't do this if they've been damaged within the last 15 seconds. Elective respawning will allow allies who are more or less certain of their demise in the coming battle to effectively deny their enemy clock cycles by preventing them from getting a killing blow, though again, only if they can manage to avoid being damaged for 15 seconds. However, if you respawn in this manner, from what I understand, you will not gain any clock cycles from fusion towers that your team controls whilst you're waiting to respawn. Now, early game with low respawn timers, this might actually be a good way to move across the map, depending on the situation that you're trying to react to. If the enemy are all at the gates and you're far away, but you're not under any particular threat, but it's early on, so the spawn time is not going to be very long, or if your team has organized it that one person is about to capture an enemy fusion tower, I could easily see this being a case of everyone, even late game, it's like, yep, it's going to be a 90-second respawn, but everyone just die now while this one person, as soon as everyone can confirm they've killed themselves, that one person shoots the last crystal, whole team respawns. I'm not sure exactly, though, whether that would be viable, because from what I read initially, during the update, I was under the impression that when people respawned due to a tower being claimed, they respawned around that tower. So that kind of tactic would be very much subject to whether the respawning units spawned around that single tower or whether they spawned back at base. Though, that being said, if the fight was all happening at one tower, again, it might be worth the whole team killing themselves spread out all across the map in order for that one last shot to cause the entire team to respawn in one place. You could effectively move your entire army across the map in a space of a few seconds, and those sorts of tactics might really come into play, especially with talk of more competitive league-like games going on. Then we might see meta tactics like that really starting to take a part in the games. But on the subject of overclocking now, this is probably one of the more complicated and also interesting parts of the game, or rather of the patches that are going to come into the new game mode. Overclocking has 13 levels. You start every battle at level 1 and level up by earning clock cycles for performing various tasks in the battle. At each new overclock level, your robot will get more powerful. The overclock HUD will display a few important pieces of information. Your SCU avatar, your supercomputer unit, I think that stands for. There'll be a couple of these to choose from in the future, and they'll have different kinds of focuses and different special abilities later on, but I'm not sure when that's all coming out, whether that will be in the features for this patch. I'm not sure it will be in the pre-launch, but it probably won't take long for those to follow through. The health of your SCU, your overclocker level, the level progress to the next level, and the amount of clock cycles that you just earned for whatever you just did, or in the most recently amount earned. For example, every second it would tick to 250, for example, from a tower. Now, clock cycles can be earned for a number of activities, and at the moment, when this launches, these will be the values. You'll get 100 clock cycles per CPU destroyed, 100 per damage in protection, so if you damage something whilst protecting someone, 500 per damage you inflict in defense, 100,000 for a kill. Now that is a big number there. 75,000 for an assist, I like the fact that the assist is not half as valuable as a kill. It's 3/4 of its valuable, which is a nice balance, I think. 150 CPU for healing. 150 clock cycles for healing each CPU. Now that's interesting. You'll get more overclock levels for healing than you do for doing damage. You'll also get 75,000 clock cycles for healing an ally from less than 100% health all the way to 100%. This is effectively a heal assist. This can only be earned once per ally per respawn, not once per game, per respawn. You'll get 1,000 I'll just call them CC, clock cycles, per destroyed Protonium crystal, 5,000 per enemy detected on your radar, 5,000 per enemy that you spot, so it's quite possible that you can detect an enemy on your radar, gain 5,000, then spot it with Q and gain another 5,000 for a total of 10,000 per enemy you discover. And finally, 250 per second for each fusion tower that your team owns. Now, there are multiplier bonuses or debuffs to overclocking. If your opponent's overclock level, or if their bot's CPU level at full health is higher than yours, you'll earn more clock cycles for damaging, killing, or spotting them, and vice versa. So if theirs is lower, then you'll get less. If your ally's overclock level or CPU level is lower than yours, you'll earn more clock cycles for healing them. Now this is interesting because it's putting the focus on healing the people who are weaker than you than healing the people who are stronger. Now that's an interesting one to go for because quite often the meta is keep the strongest people alive because they're going to be more useful, whereas this is going the opposite way and saying you'll get more points and thus become more useful yourself by keeping your weaker allies alive. The number of clock cycles required to level up ranges from 120,000 to reach level 2, all the way up to 460,303 to move from level 12 to level 13. But at level 13, the total clock cycles required to get to level 13 from level 1 is 3,078,021 clock cycles. Now, you might be wondering how exactly your overclock level affects how powerful your bot is. Well, functional components will get better in some measurable way as you get higher in your overclock level. Also, later on, there'll be things like special abilities which you'll be able to earn through overclocking and then use depending on which SCU you've decided to have, like a medic, a tank, a DPS, so on and so forth. But at the moment, just focusing on the overclocking that will happen to your functional components, and assuming you've reached level 13, I'll give the sort of max overclock that a functional component might receive at that level. So at overclock level 13, wheel speed will reach 180% of the norm, caterpillar tracks speed will be 170%, hover blades will be at 160%, which means that while hovers will be faster and better early game, wheels and tracks will catch up toward the late game. Walker legs will have a jump height which will reach 280% of its original value, whilst the carry weight will reach 200%. So at max level, combined with overclocked thrusters and good jump conditions, you don't jump straight into an ally or something like that, walkers have been tested by the devs to be able to leap across over half of the map in a single jump. Now, we're not talking jumping from a really high place and then gliding down, we're talking just leaping across half of the map. Thrusters overclock to 160% of their original speed by level 13. Both aerofoils and rudders' speed will increase to 160%, and their height ceiling will adjust to 130%, so they'll be able to fly faster and higher as a result of overclocking. Rotor speed, so the copter blades overclock, will be 150%. However, skis don't overclock, and neither do helium. They have no advantage for your overclock levels. For the defensive type of functional blocks, electroplates will regenerate 40% quicker than normal, but armor doesn't have any overclock in any way. They don't become more dense or more have a higher absorption rating for damage or anything like that. Armor is just armor, but electroplates get better as they get overclocked. As for weapons, SMG's near damage overclocks to 180% of the norm, whilst the far damage caps at 130%. Rails overclock to 130% damage, and their shot cooldown is 40% quicker. Now, that is a huge increase for Rails. At level 13, wow, just mind-bogglingly good. Plasma fire rate overclocks to 60% faster, and the blast radius to 120% of its original values. And nano disruptors, that is mediguns, will heal at their healing rate will overclock to 120%, with a range increase of, or rather, a range increased to 120%, and a damage rate overclock of 160%. So that's really interesting. As at the higher levels of overclock, a nanogun will get a better boost to how it can damage an enemy than how it can heal an ally, which is worth noting. Finally, Teslas don't overclock. Scallywaggery, I say. Poor Teslas, no love. Some special blocks also overclock. Radar detection power, radar jamming power, and radar receiver range all overclock to 160%. Headlights, most depressingly, do not overclock. There will be no burning away the heresies of enemy bots with a focused beam of purifying light for us, I am afraid. Alas. Now, we're coming up to the last part of this update that I'm going to cover for this video, and I can hear you all breathing a sigh of relief because it's been 20 minutes of me just covering patch notes. But the first big game mechanics change will be a massive change to the way nano disruptors heal. Every cube in the game will have their own individual heal rate. That is, well, you know, one tier 10 armor cube is going to be the same as any other tier 10 armor cube. But, you know, the tier 9 armor cube will have a different heal rate to the tier 10, so on and so forth. Now, this value will increase or decrease the health per second rate of a nanogun. So it's an additional modifier on the natural healing rate of that nanogun, on how fast this particular block can be healed. Armor, copter blades, aerofoils, and tracks have a massive 2 to 3 times faster heal rate, while electroplates heal almost 2 to 3 times slower. That's going to be a little bit nasty for my Megabot specifically, but really interesting to see. So if you've got a massive, heavy, tracked tank, that's going to heal faster than the small, nippy electroplated tank. Interesting way to go with that. Plasma damage model is being reworked. Hurrah! I hear many people cry at the same time. The blast now uses data that defines how much a blast can pass through a cube to the cubes underneath. Now, we're not talking passing through as in it hits the cube and then moves through the physical part of the cube. We're talking more, because if you imagine an SMG versus a tank track, they're different shapes. The SMG has a lot of empty space around it. So an explosion would be able to pass through that empty space without impediment, whereas it would just smack into the side of a tank track. And in fact, the example that I have here is if a blast hits a tank track, almost 100% of the blast will be absorbed by that component alone. So very little will pass through to the blocks behind it until that block is destroyed. Whereas if it hits an SMG, much more of the damage will just simply pass straight through or over and around, more to the point, the SMG and strike the blocks behind the SMG. So you're not really going to be able to make a gun barella, as they have been coined, to protect you from damage. Damage from a plasma can simply pass through some of these components. Now, that said, Teslas and rails are going to work kind of in the same way, but from a different direction. They're now going to be the only weapons that conduct damage through functional cubes directly to the chassis below. Each cube and component will have a resistivity value that will determine how much damage can pass directly through the solid component. So, opposed to the plasma change, which is basically passing around and through the empty spaces around a component, this damage is literally moving straight through the component. It's hitting the component, going into the component, coming out the other side. Now, this will model so that tanks, electroplates and rotors will have a very high resistance. So again, they're going to be pretty good at blocking damage from the things beneath them. But SMGs, wheels and aerofoils will be highly conductive. So not only will you be damaging the weapon, you'll also be damaging the cube that the weapon is attached to. Now that is a pretty dangerous position to be in. So rails and Teslas, rails are finally going to get this kind of piercing kind of quality that I always kind of thought they should have, and Teslas similarly. Now, protonivity, what a word, acts as a multiplier for weapon damage versus protonium crystals. SMGs and nanos will have about 100% damage to protonium crystals. Rails will have 130%. Plasmas will have a whopping 230% damage versus crystals. That is kind of frightening. I've got to be honest, you know, you get a good artillery bombardment on a Protonium crystal cluster, and you can probably say goodbye to that entire cluster. Teslas, on the other hand, will only have 10% damage. Like I said, Teslas, there's no love. No love for Teslas. But I can see why they did this. It's to nerf rush tactics where a single fast Tesla bot could simply dart into the base, through the shield, past the defenders, because let's face it, some Tesla bots move like the devil is chasing them, and smack straight into the reactor crystal cluster and take the entire thing out in one huge chain reaction and win the game in like the first 20 seconds. I can see why they've put that change in. It's probably necessary. Armor is having a flat 20% buff to its armor values, and additionally, cubes, inners, prisms, and tetras, their shapes will adjust the armor value of the block and the healing rate that they're going to be able to be healed with. So, for example, tetras will have the least armor but will heal the fastest, whereas cubes will have the most armor and heal the slowest. There's a change to progression in the game. Armor will be the only technology that you could unlock with tier -1 tech points. So, unlocking tier 2 armor with tier 1 tech points. Used to be that you could do that with SMGs and a few other things, but that is now gone. Armor is the only thing that you can over tier with a tier's tech point. So if you're playing in tier 1, the only higher tier component you're likely going to have is tier 2, unless you come back down to tier 1 to, you know, with guns that you've unlocked whilst playing at tier 2. Now, additionally, the RP costs of armor are having a whopping 20% reduction. Now that is quite significant, especially at tier 10 levels. This is actually there to help people tier up a little bit better, because if the only over-tiered component you can get whilst playing through the tiers is armor, then making it cheaper to buy will allow you to buy enough of it to plate your bot and pull yourself into the next tier a little bit easier. Wheel physics have been adjusted in light of the, frankly, dangerously high speeds that will now be possible with overclocking to afford them greater stability, allowing for almost rally car-like driving experience. Apparently, if you read the patch notes, I'm really interested in that, like drifting and stuff like that. And a much reduced instance of flipping or random wheelies. Additionally, the mass of wheels has been increased a lot, which should help with grounding the vehicle even at high speeds. Hover physics have also had a rework, with the main focus now being on making weight more of a factor on speed. Although effort has been made not to slow down the heaviest hovers too much, the lightest hovers should experience a significant improvement in speed. Generally speaking, hovers are going to remain the fastest method of moving on the ground, quote unquote, because they're not really on the ground. Of note, mega hovers have been given a huge boost to enable carrying much heavier megabots, and I'm very glad for that, because it might mean that my megabot is going to move a little bit better. In addition, in general, all functional cubes now have much more of a link to the overclocker to determine their overall speed. So, on the whole, in early game, bots are going to be a little bit slower than we're used to, while in the late games they're going to be much, much faster than is typically possible right now pre-meta change patch. But with that, I've come to the end of my little list of updates. Hopefully the patch has landed and the servers are good, and you will be able to find me streaming my early experiences in the game, or sitting in my stream crying over the fact that the servers are melting and sending as many positive waves the server's way as possible. But if you do happen to be watching this close after the patch is launched, then why don't you drop by my Twitch channel and join in on some of the shenanigans, but whether I see you in the stream or not. Until the next time we meet, do take care.